For 13 days, a storm the size of France crawled across the Pacific Ocean. By the time it finally fell apart, it had broken a record that had stood for as long as records had been kept, forced more than 2.8 million people from their homes in a single country, and left the dead scattered across 4 separate nations. This is the story of Super Typhoon Bavi, the storm that would not die, and the trail of destruction it carved from the middle of the Pacific, all the way to the northeast coast of China. Let us start with the number that stops you cold: 2.8 million. That is how many people were evacuated across China as Bavi came ashore. It was the most powerful storm to strike mainland China all year. But to understand how a single weather system could do that, we have to go back almost 2 weeks and thousands of kilometers out to sea to the moment this monster was born. Bavi formed over the open Pacific on the 30th of June, 2026. At its peak, it became a Category 5 equivalent super typhoon. The United States Joint Typhoon Warning Center clocked its winds at 285 kilometers per hour. Its central pressure dropped to around 901 hectopascals, the signature of an extraordinarily deep and dangerous storm. And it was enormous. Forecasters describe Bavi as covering an area roughly the size of France. This was not a storm you could drive around or outrun. It was a weather system the size of a country, and it was moving. The first land in its path was American soil. On the 6th of July, Bavi slammed directly into Rota in the Northern Mariana Islands, a United States territory in the western Pacific. And here, it made history in the worst possible way. Bavi became the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded to strike a United States territory. On Rota, roughly half of every structure on the island was damaged or destroyed. On the neighboring islands of Saipan and Tinian, the power grid collapsed completely. All 16,683 electrical customers lost power. Not most of them. Every single one. The mayor of Rota, Aubrey Hokog, described his island in 4 devastating words. He said, "It had been destroyed, quote, in every aspect." To put that record in perspective, Bavi's wind field, the sheer area over which it was flinging destructive winds, ranked in the top 3% of every typhoon to cross the western Pacific in the previous decade. This was not simply a strong storm. It was one of the largest and most powerful the region had produced in 10 years, and it had chosen to make its first landfall on a small, lightly built island that was home to only a few thousand people. On nearby Guam, 4 more people were injured. The name itself, Bavi, comes from a mountain range in Vietnam, and in the Philippines, the very same storm was being tracked under a second local name, Inday. 1 system, 2 names, and by now a rapidly growing list of victims. But Rota was only the beginning, because Bavi was just getting started, and it was heading west, straight toward one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. In the Philippines, where the storm was known by the local name Inday, the damage turned deadly. 23 people were killed, 14 more went missing. Nearly 783,000 people were affected by the storm in some way. 24,000 were driven from their homes, and more than 1,200 houses were damaged. But the single worst moment came in a village called Pandao in the province of Sarangani. There, the rain unleashed by Bavi soaked into ground that was already unstable, and the hillside gave way. A landslide buried part of the village, and 10 people died in that one event alone. And here is the detail that makes Pandao so chilling, and it is the part almost no one outside the region knows. That soil did not fail by chance. It had already been weakened months earlier by the 2026 Mindanao earthquake. The quake had loosened the ground. Then Bavi arrived and poured water into it. 2 separate disasters, an earthquake and a super typhoon, stacked one on top of the other, and 10 people paid for that combination with their lives. It is a grim preview of what happens when one catastrophe sets the trap and the next one springs it. Scientists have a name for this. They call it a compound disaster. 2 hazards overlapping in the same place within the same short window of time, so that the harm they do together is far worse than either one could have done alone. An earthquake that people might have survived quietly weakens a hillside. A storm that might otherwise have passed then pours water into that weakened ground, and the slope collapses. As the planet sees both heavier rainfall and continued seismic activity in the same crowded mountainous regions, the odds of these deadly overlaps only grow. On a map, Pandao is a tiny dot. But what happened there is a textbook example of the exact kind of stacked catastrophe that disaster planners around the world fear the most. As Bavi ground its way northwest, it kept lashing everything it passed. In Taiwan, 134 people were injured. As the outer bands brushed Japan, the prefecture of Okinawa reported a dozen injuries and evacuated nearly 83,000 people from the storm's path. And still, Bavi held together. Long after a normal typhoon would have weakened and collapsed, this one refused. It became the longest-lasting tropical cyclone anywhere in the Asia-Pacific region this year, a storm that simply would not die. Then, on the 11th of July, Bavi did what everyone had been dreading. It made landfall on mainland China, coming ashore at Yuhuan and Yueqing in Zhejiang province. And this is where the scale of this disaster becomes almost impossible to picture. Because Bavi did not stop at the coast. It drove inland, and then it turned north, and as it did, it dragged its enormous rain shield across one Chinese province after another: Zhejiang, Fujian, Jiangsu, Anhui, Shandong, and then the northeast, Hebei, Liaoning, and Jilin. In the city of Shenyang, the rain set a record 223.8 millimeters falling on the 13th of July alone. Across the region, 46 rivers rose above their warning levels at the same time. Roads vanished under the water. In Hebei and Liaoning, vehicles were picked up and swept away by the current. In the town of Quancheng, around 1,800 villagers were left stranded, cut off by the rising water with nowhere to go. Stop and think about what 46 rivers above their warning levels at the same time actually means. It means there was no single safe direction to run. It means rescue crews in Hebei and Liaoning were not responding to one flooded town, but to dozens of them at once, racing between villages as the water kept climbing. And it means the decision facing the authorities was no longer whether to evacuate, but how fast they could possibly move a staggering number of people before the rivers crested. And this is where that opening number finally makes sense. To get people out of the path of the flooding, Chinese authorities carried out one of the largest weather evacuations you will ever hear about. In Liaoning province alone, more than 260,000 people were moved to safety. Across the whole country, the total climbed past 2.8 million. 2.8 million human beings, packing what they could carry and leaving their homes, all because of a single storm that had formed over open water 13 days and thousands of kilometers earlier. By the time it was over, Bavi had left a bill of at least $141 million in damage. More than 124 million of that was in China alone, with millions more spread across Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. It had injured, displaced, or killed people across 5 separate places: the Mariana Islands, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and China. And it had earned a place in the record books that no place ever wants to hold. Bavi finally began to lose its grip in the middle of the month. On the 15th of July, it transitioned into an extratropical system, its warm tropical core slowly unwinding, and by the 16th, it had dissipated for good, 16 days after it first formed over the open Pacific. Only then, when the storm itself was gone, could the true scale of what it had done be counted. So how does one storm become this? How does a typhoon grow to the size of a country, break a record that has stood for decades, and stay alive for almost 2 weeks? The answer is warmth and water. Typhoons are heat engines. They feed on warm ocean water, pulling that energy up into themselves and converting it into wind. When a storm tracks over a long stretch of unusually warm sea, it does not just survive, it intensifies, and it keeps intensifying for as long as the fuel lasts. Bavi crossed exactly that kind of water, and it crossed a lot of it, which is why it grew so large and lasted so long. A storm the size of France does not appear by accident. It is built mile by mile from the heat stored in an ocean that has been quietly warming for decades. And this is the part that should give everyone pause. As the world's oceans keep warming, the fuel supply for storms like Bavi grows with them. A storm that can flatten a U.S. territory, stack a landslide on top of an earthquake, and force millions to flee is not supposed to be an ordinary event. The fear among scientists is that storms like this are slowly becoming less rare. If you want the real story behind these disasters, the true numbers, the real records, the science, without the fake death tolls you see everywhere else, then subscribe and you'll be here for the next one. Because the ocean that built Bavi is still out there, still warm, still waiting. The 2.8 million people who fled will go home and begin to rebuild. The island of Rota will piece itself back together. But somewhere over the Pacific, the water is already gathering its next storm. And after Bavi, no one on that coastline is ever going to look at a distant cluster of clouds the same way again.